Hello and welcome to this round 6 of Grand Prix Stockholm. Here in Sweden we have Jeremy Dzani, former player of the year. He's 5-0 with Bant Spirits, and he's up against the number 22 ranked player in the world right now. Piotr Glogowski is playing Ironworks Combo. So two very different strategies here for this modern format.
Absolutely. I'm interested to see where this goes. Of course, the Ironworks combo deck has the faster clock, but Bant Spirits is known for its disruption, especially Spellqueller, of course, very good against Ironworks.
The turn 1 Noble Hierarch means that a Spell Queller could be threatened as early as the second turn. But in terms of stopping what the Ironworks combo has going, how quickly do you need to have that counter magic up and running?
I think turn 3 is where you want to start having something up, because that's where the Scrap Trawlers and potentially Clark Crown Ironworks can come down, depending on your turn 2 play, of course.
Dzani on the play, meaning that he does get the opportunity to get some kind of a threat on the battlefield before he needs to worry about counter magic of any kind. And I guess that's what Bant Spirits is all about, really, isn't it? You have your regular clock in the air, quite difficult to block for quite a lot of decks in the format. And then on top of that, you've got just enough disruption to mean that your clock is going to be able to end the game.
This is your classical aggro tempo approach. You build up a little bit of an air force, maybe get a quick Geist of Saint Draft, also amazing in this matchup, of course. And then you just sit there with your Spell Quellers and your reactive cards, maybe a Hexproof Spirit, and then often allured to surprise your opponent that your clock is one turn faster than they expected.
I like having Mausoleum Wanderer here in play alongside that Supreme Phantom as well, because it does mean that there's a little bit of counter magic just sat on the battlefield here. You can sacrifice Mausoleum Wanderer to counter an instant or sorcery unless its controller pays, in this case, 2 mana, because Supreme Phantom pumping that Mausoleum Wanderer up to being a 2/2 flyer.
Yeah. There is, however, the problem that it doesn't counter artifacts. So against Ironworks combo in particular, it's less good.
Yeah, I mean, this is mainly, it's Ancient Stirrings or bust almost in terms of what it's countering, but it may be that that's worth considering at some point in this game. From here on out, though, Dzani will have a lot more to think about how much mana he wants to be tapping at any given moment, rather than just attacking in, plinking in for a little bit of damage each turn and staying a little bit safer.
Yeah, I haven't seen Dzani's hand here. Oh, but he's showing most of it, actually. That's an impressive draw.
So Supreme Phantom and Mausoleum Wanderer coming in. They've both got Hexproof and +1/+1 thanks to the captain. The Mausoleum Wanderer also with +1/+1 thanks to the Phantom in play as well. So
and its own trigger, so actually quite a lot of damage. And are we looking at lethal already next turn?
I mean, the good thing for Dzani is, from this point onwards, he doesn't need to put any more threats on the battlefield. His threats are plenty big enough to be able to end this game. He can now just hope to fade this turn, which seems pretty reasonable based on what's currently going on, and then, assuming that he gets through this turn okay, he's probably in good shape to be able to hold up interaction for the rest of this game.
Winning the die roll was absolutely critical for Dzani here. If you imagine all of this one turn delayed, it's a very different game.
Now, Piotr here still has the potential to be able to eke out a win this turn, but it's a pretty big ask for the Ironworks combo to go off in this scenario. Essentially, it's going to involve some amount of clever business involving Moxes.
Mox Opal. I think if you have a Mox Opal here and you start with Ironworks, then you have a shot.
So generating green mana there with Chromatic Sphere. Having to sacrifice the sphere does mean that getting to the requisite 3 artifacts for Metalcraft a little bit harder for Mox Opal.
Piotr just secured platinum level in the US.
A fantastic achievement. A whole host of Pro Tours next year going to be kicking off the season relatively soon. Of course, our World Championship this very next weekend. Be sure to tune in for that one. It'll be taking place in Las Vegas. And platinum level is exactly the sort of thing that you want to be if you want to potentially in the future lock up those spots at the World Championship.
Interesting card here.
Engineered Explosives on 1. There are a lot of 1-drop creatures on the other side of the battlefield. 2 Noble Hierarchs, 1 Mausoleum Wanderer, all succumbing to that single removal spell. So Supreme Phantom, Drogskull Captain in play. They're not going to threaten lethal this next turn. Piotr Glogowski has successfully secured himself at least 1 more turn's respite.
Yeah, this was huge. Also denying Desani the mana. Maybe Desani could have cast a collected company. That's not well. Actually, he had the Horizon Canopy, so we know that he's not holding collected company, or he was not holding collected company. But now suddenly a single engineered explosives out of what is a combo deck gave Piotr a bunch more turns here. Maybe even 2 more turns.
Yeah, the easy bit for Jeremy Desani here is turning his creatures sideways and attacking. It's figuring out what he's doing with all of the rest of his mana that gets a little bit fiddlier here. He plays a Supreme Phantom, which means that he's at least shortening that clock.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. You are not playing around the win here. Of course, there is a chance that Piotr has it, but it's still not easy to go off with only one other artifact in play.
I mean, Ichor Wellspring, at the point it gets sacrificed, it's generating 2 mana from the Ironworks. It's also drawing a card thanks to its own text. And we can see here Piotr using dice just to indicate how much mana he has floating around. This is not a deck that needs to be thinking about Storm. So Terrarion costs 1, sacrifice it for 2, and when it goes to the graveyard, you draw a card. So this is kind of what Piotr needs to be doing if he's going to go off this turn, is continually chaining together these artifacts that generate him mana, generate him cards, but actually winning the game without the likes of Scrap Trawler or Mirror Retriever is going to be almost impossible.
And if you play the Scrap Trawler here, you don't have any other artifacts in play. So if you don't... Okay, now we're getting somewhere, because suddenly Piotr is generating extra mana here and drawing extra cards. So he might be pulling this off, and he has to anyway. So because of the amount of power on Desani's side of the table, Grogowski just had to go for it and is saying, look, if I get there, that's great. If not, I would have lost anyway.
Yeah, and this is, in some respects, a very pure way of going off, because he doesn't need to think about interaction. He doesn't need to think about anything beyond, I either win this turn or the game is over.
It's the purest form of Magic, really.
Almost exactly what Dr. Garfield was anticipating. So an engineered explosives for 0 here. We're seeing another use of the explosives. They represent mana generation in addition to what they've already done to Desani's board.
And I think... Yep. That's what Piotr was drawing towards. And now he has not quite the loop, but we will see him go through the motions of sacrificing artifacts and always triggering the Scrap Trawler for additional value.
It makes it much, much easier to go off. And from talking to Ben Stark when he played this deck to a finalist's position at the Pro Tour, he said that sort of a lot of the time you end up thinking about each card in the deck in terms of, with an Ironworks in play, where does this leave me on mana? Where does this leave me on cards? And you can essentially think of cards as being +1 mana, +1 card, etc., and gradually puzzle together your overall win.
Engineered Explosives was the MVP this match. It's not only allowed it to stay alive for longer, it's also being the poor man's Mox Opal here, in the sense that you're getting 2 mana at least from every Scrap Trawler cycle. Yeah,
using every piece of the Buffalo here in order to get things working. And you can see that Mind Stone is kind of an interesting one when it comes to how it interacts in this entire cavalcade of artifacts going all over the place, because you can pay 1 and sacrifice it just to draw a card. And there are moments in the combo where you're short on mana, but often it's cards that you're really shortest on while you're assembling what is ultimately a big old loop.
Yeah, and can we give credit to Piotr here, how quickly he's playing this? Yeah, spending almost no time on the mechanics of what's going on.
And it is important to be able to get through this deck quickly, because the last thing that you want is to be in the draw bracket against lots of control decks that can counter your key spell again and again and again. You just want to keep on winning.
Yeah, and having two Scrap Trawlers in play is almost guaranteed to be sufficient here.
Mox Opal making it much, much easier to do things. You get to keep playing that Mox, tapping it for mana, sacrificing it for more mana. It's like having something akin to a Black Lotus alongside everything else. Ultimately there, we kind of shortcutted to the end a little bit. We got the handshake from Jeremy Desani, but what was going on was that we were going to end up with a situation where Mirror Retriever was getting bought back periodically. It was in the process also getting back other artifacts. Gradually you're getting to dig through your deck with chromatic stars. At some point you've generated an arbitrary amount of mana and as many ways of getting back artifacts as you need, at which point Pyrite Spellbomb represents unbounded damage. Piotr Glogowski successfully executing a combo from a pretty unlikely looking position at the start of that turn.
And that's the power of Ironworks. What many thought was only a deck that's good in the hands of Matt Nass and other combo fans, it's actually a very resilient combo deck that in game 1 can win as early as turn 3. That actually happened to me. I was playing Storm and I thought, no problem, I'll play my Baral and win easily. No, the KCI player out-tempoed me by going off on turn 3 2 times, and it's not that hard in game 1. And after sideboarding, the nice thing is you have a lot of green sources, so these Stony Silences and Rest in Pieces are actually cards you can handle, as opposed to, if you remember Affinity, if a Stony Silence comes down, you're really stumbling.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few innovations in the deck over its time in Modern. It's a relative newcomer to the format, but that does not mean to say that there's not been some interesting updates to it. The first big one was the discovery of the ability to do some cool loops involving declaring casting a spell, sacrificing both a Mirror Retriever and a Scrap Trawler to Krark-Clan Ironworks to help generate the mana to pay the cost of that spell, and then because they go to the graveyard at the same time, letting them both get each other back to your hand.
And that's effectively the loop already.
Yes,
because you are you're getting a Scrap Trawler trigger as well with every iteration.
That generates a lot of the most straightforward big actual loops and combos that the deck will do. The other addition, which is not so much about a clever rules interaction, but just simply adding a good card, was Psy Master Thopterist. A card that just gives a very straightforward way of adjusting the game plan, especially after sideboarding. You're obviously casting a ton of artifacts in the process of going off anyway, and it means that in those matchups where you feel like maybe you're getting beaten down a little bit or there's too much disruption to be able to go for the main win, there's still a way of winning that game.
Yeah, Psy Master Thopter is definitely a card that's tricky to assess, because how many do you want to bring in? When do you bring it in? Are there maybe matchups where you bring it in for one game but not the other? It's a skill tester, I would say, and on both sides.
I mean, the other cool thing, I guess, about Ironworks combo is that it doesn't need to run a lot of specific colored sources. It has a lot of ways of generating mana of any color between all of its stars, between its access to Mox Opal and so on and so forth, which means that in the grand scheme of things, if it did want to run a surprising sideboard card in another color, it does have that facility if it really wanted to.
You could easily make it work, for sure.
As things stand, you can see these players just finishing their shuffling up. Jeremy Dazani looking a little bit discontent with the situation, but you know what? That's pretty much Dazani's game face. He always looks a little bit worried, a little bit maybe disgruntled while he's playing. Doesn't necessarily serve as much of an indicator of anything as to his actual mood.
It's not like Piotr is all smiles all the time. No, this is just two professional Magic players going about their business, having... Well, knowing the importance of this match, which is, it's important. It's not, a finals of a Pro Tour or anything. But you are at 5-0. You want to finish the season with a good result at a GP. Although for Piotr, I think most of the pressure is gone now that he has secured Platinum. That's, of course, the big goal he was aiming towards.
Yeah, and in some respects, I mean, ignoring the Reed Dukes and Luis Salvatos of this world, for a lot of the players that are at this specific GP, part of it comes down to there are a lot of players that really do just enjoy this modern format quite a bit, and this is, for many players, it can almost be treated as a one-off GP where it's just about having fun and trying to get a good result rather than advancing too many long-term goals.
The main motivation to come here is to play Modern, to see Stockholm, a really beautiful Scandinavian city, and then for a few players here, and we are talking about the 1%, it's about those final pro points or maybe securing a status.
Yeah, I mean, we've got, for example, one of the other races that may get cleared up at some point this weekend is who's going to be the Danish national champion representing Team Denmark at the World Magic Cup. Currently, Simon Nielsen looking in good shape, but it's possible that the likes of Michael Bonda could catch up with him depending on how results fall this weekend. And, of course, not a big trip from Denmark to Sweden whatsoever.
No, you can probably go by bike. I don't know if that's true, but...
If we were in Malmo, I would say yes.
There's probably some bridge somewhere.
There is a bridge from
directly takes you to wherever you want to go.
Okay, so here's an explosive start from Piotr Glogowski. He has the turn 1 Mox Opal with sufficient artifacts in play to be able to activate it, sacrifices Chromatic Sphere. He's got green mana floating, gets to cast a Chromatic Star, pass the turn. Good solid beginning there for Glogowski.
Much better than the Mutavault on Desani's side. In game 1, he had the tremendous mana advantage of turn 1 Noble Hierarch.
And indeed being on the play.
And being on the play. So, and even there, Piotr managed to just barely assemble all the pieces of his combo. Now, Desani is there with a super weak start. We have to say, Piotr can do whatever he wants, basically.
I mean, already this deck has drawn 2 extra cards thanks to Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star. This is a list that it doesn't have the one sort of shining light card drawing spell, though Ancient Stirrings is certainly making an argument for getting close to that point. But it can do a lot of digging.
Mm-hmm. So, just as an interesting tidbit here, 3 Rest in Peace, 3 Stony Silence in Desani's sideboard. So, it's not like he isn't prepared, but I'm wondering what made him keep this hand. I think it has to be those spell crawlers. Just saying, look, you can't really win if I counter your key pieces. And we will see if that's true.
I mean, there are spell crawlers. There's now enough mana to be able to cast them. So, if you're in Jeremy Desani's seat, what are the cards that you're saying I must counter this?
Sai, Master Thopterist, but also Scrap Trawler and KCI. I don't think you want either of those in play. KCI because of the mana advantage, Scrap Trawler because it alone is representing so much value that it's quite scary. Even if it's not doing anything, having a Scrap Trawler on the battlefield means you have to be very careful all of the time.
Now, I like the fact a lot here that Sai didn't resolve, because that's the one that if it's in play, even if Rest in Peace and Stony Silence are in play, Sai on its own can represent a game plan for the Ironworks combo deck. So that first Sai having been dealt with, a very big piece of the puzzle here. And Desani, he had the option there of playing a Rest in Peace just to kind of send a message for now. It doesn't need to be in play just yet, but at some point soon it might be. Instead, choosing to sit back on another copy of Spell Queller.
And Collected Company. So while his hand was slow, we can understand why he wanted to keep it. I don't think the Rest in Peace was in his hand from the beginning.
I believe not. No, I think he drew into it on turn 3 and decided that he wanted Spell Queller more.
Which makes a lot of sense. Don't show the Rest in Peace to Piotr until you have to.
Another copy of Sai. Are we going to see the exact same play again? It would certainly make sense to me if it was good enough last turn. I can't imagine that it would not be now. And interestingly, when there's one Sai under a Spell Queller, you kind of go, well, you could always kill off the Spell Queller. That's another way of getting your Sai back. And Engineered Explosives here, if it killed off both Spell Quellers, one of those Sais would die to the Legend rule anyway.
Sure.
Not that you need more than one.
I wonder if Piotr brought in his burn spells. Lightning Bolt is really good against Spell Queller, but also against a lot of the lords that the Spirit decks want to play.
And as we were talking about all of the different coloured options available to Ironworks, in principle, something like Firespout, another option, you can either cast it for... Oh, there we see it. In this case, casting it for green, I would imagine, only needing to deal damage to flyers.
Mm-hmm. Well, you could also cast it for green and red. It doesn't really hurt.
But the interesting thing about Firespout, of course, that if you've got Sai Master Thopterist in play and you're playing against humans, you just need to kill all of those ground creatures and keep your Thopters alive. That's an option available to you.
deceptively powerful card.
Is there anything that Jeremy Tizani can do about this one?
I think he's debating about this collected company. He kind of has to evaluate how many lords or like which cards he could hit off of collected company in response that would make it a good play.
Yeah, any lord that will itself survive the fire spout would mean that the spell Queller's would survive the fire spout.
But those don't exist, right?
But if he hits double lord, it's good. If he hits one of the 2 remaining spell Quellers, it's good.
Yeah, I don't think you can risk it because the problem is you need two 3 toughness lords. If you hit a 2 toughness and a 3 toughness lord, it's still not enough. So
Unified Will there, the counterspell that was used to deal with it. Unified Will, just a very, very powerful counterspell in a matchup like this where you ought to have more creatures than your opponent almost always.
oh wow, now Tizani also has a Stony Silence, and Stony Silence is actually a double Stone Rain for Piotr.
Yeah, it will mean that artifacts cannot activate their abilities, and crucially that does include mana abilities. So Mox Opal will not be able to tap for mana. Darksteel Citadel will not be able to tap for mana. Goes for the Stony Silence, the Stony Rain Silence, if you will.
Unsurprisingly, that's, I think, if Piotr doesn't have Nature's Claim immediately.
Yeah, it's a big ask at this point for Piotr to get out of this, unless he's able to deal with the enchantment very quickly indeed, because 3 spirits coming in, a Mutavault on the ground, 2 spell Quellers in the air, a 2-turn clock being represented by Tizani before he plays anything else in these next couple of turns.
3 spirits and a Yeti.
All right, so Jeremy Tizani, he came with this matchup firmly in his mind and had appropriate sideboard cards, was able to deploy them very straightforwardly there. While Glagowski had the great turn 1, he didn't really have too much in the way of follow-up before Tizani was able to start deploying counter magic.
Yeah, and this is the thing. He cast his size in particular, and he drew counters with them. So that's not bad at all. It's just he needs more than a side to win the game. He needs to actually assemble his combo. I don't think that you're winning against Spirits by just casting a Sai and your artifacts. Spirits is probably the best setup to beat a bunch of 1/1 flyers.
Yeah, all of its creatures at worst are going to be trading in that fight, apart from, I guess, Noble Hierarch. And a lot of the time, they can just overpower a Spirit.
Yeah. If I'm looking at Glagowski's sideboard, I think you have to bring in all your disenchant effects because you're playing against a white deck, and that means Rest in Peace and Stony Sands are just there, which also means you have to be. It becomes kind of tricky with your engineered explosives. You cannot engineer explosives when there's a Stony Sands on the battlefield, but you can engineer explosives when there is a Rest in Peace on the battlefield. So if you have an engineered explosives on 2 on the battlefield and your opponent has multiple enchantments, one of which is Stony Sounds, it's best to just wait and sit there and then pick the right time to Nature's Claim the Stony Sounds so that you can get rid of multiple Rest in Pieces potentially. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You have to kind of pick your spot, and then you have to immediately present the combo and go for it. Maybe a Lightning Bolt for the Spell Queller that the Spirits deck has. But all these kind of things, you don't have infinite time.
Yeah, the Spirits deck is able to deploy a fairly impressive Air Force to attack life totals while doing all of this disruption. And ultimately, I'm a player, I've always loved playing decks similar to this, whether it be White Weenie, whether it be Fairies, whether it be humans, whether it be counter Slivers, counter Rebels, all sorts of those options. Essentially, when you see these decks that have lots of small creatures that synergize well with each other, to be honest, it's not really about the creatures themselves. They're just kind of warm bodies that end the game. It's about how good is the disruption, considering that you know that you're going to be able to get comparatively scary creatures in play at comparatively low cost.
Yeah, and that's the challenge for Piotr Now that he's on the play again, how much of his sideboarding is dedicated to answering threats? How much of it is dedicated to answering disruption? And how much of it is still supporting his main combo? Because his deck, he doesn't have dead cards to take out, really. Every card he takes out is somehow weakening his main game plan. If you look at Desani's deck list, those four Path to Exiles he can take out unless he wants them specifically for Sai Master Thopterist.
Yeah, and that, I guess, the danger of playing an all-in combo deck, which certainly in Game 1 Ironworks represents, is that if it stumbles, it was moving at a much greater pace and it'll hurt itself quite badly, whereas there's no one card that you could force Jeremy Desani not to play with in Game 2 that he wouldn't still be able to pretty handily win the game.
Yeah. If you ask me, or what I would do, and I have a lot less experience with Ironworks combo than Piotr, I would probably not go for a plan involving Sai in Game 3. Because of the potential to just have that one Nature's Claim and go off with my remaining cards. I don't want to dilute my deck too much. I would actually prefer to see a few Lightning Bolt effects to deal with Spell Quellers and early creatures.
So both players taking mulligans here, and when we're talking about a matchup like this, I feel like there's the potential that some of these mulligans could be what I would call a strategic mulligan rather than a forced mulligan, as you will.
And by strategic, you mean I'm looking for my sideboard cards mulligan?
Yeah, so if Desani has a hand that had, say, 2 or 3 lands plus various Spirit Lords, maybe a Mausoleum Wanderer, is that going to be good enough? And I think that there's a reasonable suggestion that the answer to that is no, it's not. Meanwhile, if he's got a hand, if he's mulliganing into a hand that has 1 land, Rest in Peace, and Stony Silence, that could easily be good enough.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Even though he's going down on cards. For Glogowski, depending on the exact nature of how he's sideboarded, I don't think it's necessarily quite as clear, but it's an interesting thing to consider that every now and again, especially given you get the scry afterwards, taking a mulligan because your hand is not good in the matchup rather than not good in abstract is pretty important.
Also keep in mind that Desani is bringing in more than half of his sideboard. So he has a really high chance to find high impact sideboard cards. Whereas for Piotr, it's more about, can this starting hand beat a Stony Silence? Can this starting hand beat a Rest in Peace? Do I have a game plan against a quick start by my opponent? Do I have a game plan against a disruptive start from my opponent? I think the complexity of this matchup, and this is something that Bun Spirits does, it's part of the appeal of the deck. The burden of complexity is really on Piotr's side.
So these players just carefully figuring out where they sit on mulligans. Desani now going down to 5. At what point do you have to start thinking, in Desani's spot, I can't afford to go lower?
Well, I think 5 is where you really don't want to go lower. 4 cards, even on the draw, is pretty terrible. But you're still thinking 5 cards. That could be 2 lands, a bunch of sideboard cards, maybe a Noble Hierarch and a 3-drop. Even this Geist of Saint Traft is looking very, very good. You don't need a lot of cards to win with Geist of Saint Traft.
Meanwhile, if I'm on the Ironworks combo side of things, because every card is a pretty important piece of a big old puzzle, I feel like that's a deck that, if it had to draw a line in the sand of mulligan this far, no further, it might well have to keep more substantial hands rather than higher quality ones.
Yeah, you need to reach those 4 mana at least to cast your Ironworks at some point. Okay, good mana for Desani, and that has to be enough. Good mana, a few spirits to play. Nothing spectacular, but I think
it shouldn't need to be too spectacular.
Is Piotr passing the turn? Piotr kept a no-lander?
And if it's a no-lander with a Mox, then we start to get somewhere, but he still needs 2 lands, if that's going to be the case. Yeah, this is an interesting. If he had sort of Mox engineered explosives,
Well, we will see.
we certainly will. And there's a Spire of Industry. So
There is definitely a Mox. There's also engineered explosives and a chromatic star. So Piotr is definitely in this now.
So he plays the Mox that turn in spite of the fact that it's not active yet. Interesting.
Yeah, probably just playing around counter magic. Not super relevant, but he really needs that Mox to resolve.
Yeah, I guess a unified will would feel very unfortunate. Noble Hierarch coming down now, and that meaning an attack for 2 from Dazani here with his Mausoleum Wanderer. Exalted there, doing the work rather than the Hierarch being a spirit to pump the Wanderer just the once.
Keeping on 6 with no lands is a gutsy move.
I like it. I can dig it. There's engineered explosives, so casting it on 1.
Okay, now try to top deck the next land, or maybe just make a green to Ancient Stirrings.
Okay.
The Ironworks deck sees so many cards, so if you get going, it's not impossible to just make those land drops.
So
But not this turn.
ends up casting Terrarian. Interestingly, if he'd found a land that was not a Darksteel Citadel, then cracking the explosives for 1 to kill 2 of Dazani's creatures, his Mox Opal would then be stranded for a while.
True.
As things stand, Selfless Spirit in hand for Jeremy Dazani could come along at some point in order to mean that the engineered explosives get leveled, as it were.
Oh yeah, the Selfless Spirit activation usually pretty irrelevant, but in this case could be could have an impact.
Pumps up Mausoleum Wanderer for a turn, so the Wanderer attacking for 3 this turn, thanks to Exalted as well.
Also not a difficult choice to protect Mausoleum Wanderer and Noble Hierarch at the cost of 1 power compared to the Mausoleum Wanderer.
So Glogowski, right now, in terms of enacting his combo, there's not very much disruption on Jeremy Dazani's side of things. But we still don't know quite the details of his keep.
Of Piotr's keep?
Yeah.
No, but I mean, if you don't have many lands, you usually have spells to work with. That's a good start. If you ask me to guess, I would say he has Scrap Trawler, maybe even Ironworks in hand. Just needs to find those lands. Of course, that's a pure speculation, but simply by the numbers.
Lightning Bolt first on that Selfless Spirit. Now, there's only 1 mana floating right now, so if the Selfless Spirit sacrifices itself, it's not as if those engineered explosives can get used this turn to deal with the other 2 creatures there. Is there a reason not to sacrifice it here?
The engineered explosives? Or the spirit?
Not sacrifice the spirit.
You always sacrifice the spirit. I think Dazani was thinking of whether there is some alternative play.
He and I were in a very similar spot in that regard. So here's the follow-up play. Spire of Industry, cast Ica Wellspring, draw another card.
Yeah, and I think this is how Piotr was envisioning it. Keep the clock of Dazani slow. I like the Lightning Bolt here. You know that once there is a Selfless Spirit in play, you need to deal with... You can't deal with the Spell Queller, for example, with that Lightning Bolt, so just take care of the Spirit itself. Also makes the threat of Engineered Explosives live again. And all the time, Piotr didn't actually have to sacrifice the explosives, so the Mox Opal stayed live as well.
Now, Dazani here, he's got 3 mana open, which means that some of his big interaction is now live and might well need to be based on the way things are looking on the other side of the board.
But he has to deploy more. If he sits on this board and just attacks for 2, let's say with a Spell Queller in hand, then Piotr just passes the turn pops the explosives and says, "You have nothing. What's your play here?"
Yeah, this is a really interesting position that we find ourselves in here. Drogskull Captain attack for 1, 2, 3, 4 in total. All right, what does Piotr have here? He's got the land. He has an ironworks.
Does he just have it?
I mean, he may do.
Was the engineered explosives just a bluff all along?
Well, I mean, it's the best kind of bluff in as much as it was a semi-bluff. It forced Jeremy Dzani into making a whole bunch of decisions, but it may simply have...
Actually, Piotr can still just pop it, yeah. That's even better. He got almost everything he wanted here.
Yeah, Ironworks once in play, a little bit trickier to deal with. Now, there's still a lot of very important sideboard cards that Jeremy Dzani could just throw onto this battlefield that would force Piotr to have more non-combo cards in order to be able to go off. But Piotr hasn't really played that many cards considering the fact that he's now got mana available to him. So there's every reason to think he could just be sitting on a Nature's Claim here.
This is really quite beautiful. Let's not forget that Piotr mulligan to 6 didn't play a land on turn 1 and Jeremy mulligan to 5. So this is not these two decks operating on maximum capacity. But Dzani is suddenly finding himself in a spot where he's holding a Path to Exile without a target, a Disdainful Stroke after Klaghorn Ironworks has already resolved, and not enough pressure to even threaten something that resembles a clock.
Yeah, normally when I see players taking this many mulligans, I think, well, we're not really going to have very much of a game here. This is going to be unfortunate. But this, in many respects, has been a much more interesting game than if Dzani had kept on 7, because Dzani's keeps on 7 in this matchup a pretty game-ending.
Yep, are pretty brutal. And Piotr is, of course, super happy with how, especially these last 2 turns, developed. I really like the Lightning Bolt into not sacrificing engineered explosives, but generating a bit of value with the Wellspring, and then the big turn, so to speak, resolving Ironworks while Dzani was forced to tap out, because as we saw with the engineered explosives on 1, not playing anything was just not an option.
And you saw Piotr Glogowski there. He played his Darksteel Citadel so that his Mox Opal could tap for green. He cast his Ancient Stirrings, then just put his hands in his lap and waited. He wanted to get a sense of whether or not there was any kind of meaningful interaction coming on the other side of things. There wasn't. It resolved, and he's managed to get himself a Scrap Trawler, and Scrap Trawler alongside everything else that's going on, he is fast approaching an endgame here. I love it. Not playing the Scrap Trawler just yet. Jeremy Dzani's got mana open, and he's going to have to deploy something else if he's really going to threaten Glogowski's life total. Lightning Bolt coming along here at the exact right time to mean that the amount of responses is very limited.
Yeah, playing around Spellcrawler in particular, because if he plays something and it gets Spellcrawlered, it's quite awkward. But here, by bolting the captain, Dzani doesn't have anything in play again, so needs to deploy something which either means he has to cast a Spellcrawler or he has to tap out of Spellcrawler mana.
This has been a very, very well played game by Piotr Glogowski here.
Dzani is also playing well. It's just Piotr is forced to play well because missteps by him would be super costly. And he's really demonstrating why this KCI deck is so good. The amount of lines you have available that are not immediately obvious is just tremendous. I also think that Dzani overboarded a little bit. I don't think you can bring in Rest in Peace, Stony Silence, Unified Will, Disdainful Stroke, and keep in Path to Exile. That's just intuitively seems like you're overdoing it. And just like I was expecting Piotr to take out this size for game 3, I would have taken out all the paths in Dzani's spot.
So when we talk about over sideboarding, I just want to make sure that we're all understanding you correctly, Simon. Is the concern here that Desani's deck doesn't have enough threats in this game 3?
Yep, exactly. Or that his draws are just a little less explosive, a little less threatening to Piotr, because your biggest asset in this matchup is still, despite all the sideboard cards, is still the clock you put on your opponent. Every turn that goes by and you're drawing lands or these spells with these low impact spells are benefiting the Ironworks combo deck.
Yeah, and Desani here, he's looking on an Ironworks combo deck that has Krark-Clan Ironworks in play. It has its first card draw just sat there ready. You know it's got Scrap Trawler in hand. He can't afford to tap out too far because he wants to at least represent being able to interact favorably with that Scrap Trawler.
Yeah, and the nice thing here is Piotr showed that he respects Spellqueller. So Jeremy is smart to represent Spellqueller again. Doesn't really matter if he has it or not. He needs to now do everything in his power to make Piotr believe that Spellqueller is a threat.
Now, unfortunately for Desani here, even though he has Path to Exile doesn't interact nearly as well against what's going on for Glogowski here because he's already got that Ironworks in play.
I think we will probably see exactly that. Piotr now has a card draw trigger on the stack, and is probably targeting a 1-mana artifact, the Terrarian, in his graveyard. So these two triggers are on the stack. If you Path to Exile the Scrap Trawler now, Piotr gets 2 additional mana, and the trigger from the Scrap Trawler, targeting the Wellspring again. So, and there's also Buried Ruin in play now for Piotr, which is the icing on the cake, of course.
We know how much you love cakes, Simon, and this cake's looking like a tasty one now. Icing, at some point it feels likely that we might even find a cherry on top by the end of this turn.
Yeah, actually, when I was talking about the Path to Exile and why I would sideboard it out, I was thinking only of Sai. I don't even think keeping it in against Scrap Trawler is a viable strategy at all. To me, trying to win against KCI by Path to Exiling Scrap Trawler is a fight you can't win.
Now, Sidemaster Thopterist has come down here for Glogowski, so he's going to get a chance to make a second cake here. We're in a bake-off situation, and quite frankly, right now, Jeremy Desani hasn't even remembered to bring the sugar.
Yeah, only one person is baking.
Somehow or other, Glogowski is all of the competitors, and Jeremy Desani is me at home realizing I don't even have any bread to eat while watching.
Well, but when you are a spectator, you always hope that you get something at the end of the show, right?
So now we've just got, in many respects, even while going off Sidemaster Thopterist is kind of interesting because it just means that every artifact also represents 2 more mana with your Thopter that you get from Sai.
Mm-hmm.
So while we're not at a complete endgame yet, we're so close that it's almost not worth talking about.
I like how Desani's occasionally checking the Disdainful Stroke in his hand. Just saying, can I counter that? No. Can I counter that? Nope. Still not.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of it being disdainful, his disdain right now is probably for the stroke itself. Ultimately extends his hand as Piotr Glogowski successfully navigates his way through what was a pretty dangerous-looking matchup for him at a large proportion of the time there, advancing to 6-0 here at Grand Prix Stockholm.
Very good Magic. I wouldn't have expected that after the mulligan to 6 go on turn 1.
Yeah, after game 2, where it looked like Jeremy Desani had all the plans that he needed to be able to win that matchup, ultimately Glogowski finding a way. We will have more Magic for you here from round 6 soon enough. Do not go anywhere. More Magic after these messages. Hello and welcome back to coverage of Grand Prix Stockholm. Tim Willoughby here along with Pro Tour winner Simon Gertsen, and we're going to get a chance to see one of our players chasing Player of the Year in our feature match area. But before we do, a quick update for Reed Duke fans. Things are going a little bit rough for our American hero that's travelled across the pond to try and potentially upset Seth Manfield. He has lost this round, so we're going to get a chance to see him next round on the bubble. In the meantime, we're going to get a chance to see, we're jumping in partway through Luis Salvato's match against Ben Jones. Luis already a game up against Grisky's Death Shadow. Blue-white control in the hands of Salvato, the third-ranked player in the world. Ben Jones, well, on Death Shadow, he's got the potential to have some very explosive starts here, and indeed to protect them with a little bit of counter magic.
Yep, and doesn't have to worry too much about his life total either.
Yeah, the blue-white control list, it's not about doing a lot of damage fast, but it's about just consistently stopping what's going on the other side of things. Early doors, not a great surprise to see Ben Jones filling up his graveyard. The first Gomag Angler is in that graveyard, but the second one could easily spring out of Ben's hand pretty sharpish.
Yeah, Path to Exile is actually one of the key cards in the matchup, dealing with those undercosted Delph creatures or Death Shadow itself.
As things stand, 3 lands, and then we have the Dynamite duo of Jace the Mind Sculptor and Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Then one of those Path to Exiles that we just spoke of, and a Vendilion Click. Strong-looking hand here from Salvato.
Very strong hand. I think Jace could be the pick here. It really depends on Ben Jones's hand. I assume that he has answers to Vendilion Click. Oh, wow. This is, like I said, it's an important card in the matchup, but from a raw power level perspective, it is weaker than the Planeswalkers.
You can see these players moving at a relatively brisk pace here. Important, obviously, for each of these players to try and avoid a draw where possible. There are circumstances where getting a draw is good enough, but typically those circumstances don't come up very often on day one of a GP.
I also think this is slightly sped up, just from the mannerism.
Mishra's Bauble coming down for Ben Jones. Alongside, here is a Gomag Angler. It's going to try and eat Luis Salvato's life total, but first up, it's going to eat a whole bunch of cards from Jones's graveyard.
It's a hungry fish.
Hungry zombie fish at that. And of course, this makes a lot of sense of why the Thoughtseize did take Path to Exile when it did. It was the most meaningful interaction with the zombie at this stage in the game. But I believe that Salvato has drawn an oust, so this could work out a little bit awkwardly for Jones.
I agree with everything you said, and I think that taking Path there was a mistake. There is just going to be a redundant amount of creature hate, creature removal that you have to fight through as the Grixis Death Shadow player. Your task is to present one threat at a time and to always force your opponent to answer it and play the next one, and so on and so on. And the worst thing that can happen to you is actually a Jace or a Teferi while you're trying to enact that plan, because it just crushes whatever you're trying to do. And let's not forget that Jace is also tremendous against Gurmak Angler by itself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, while it seems strange to say, Path to Exile might be the best case scenario for a Gurmak Angler that is being killed, because at least you get a land out of it. Whereas, I mean, we saw Terminus was ultimately what took it down. If it's a Terminus, if it's an oust, if it's a Jace, all of these things, functionally, they work pretty well, and you don't get a land.
Yeah, I understand Ben Jones's reasoning. I see also that there's a disdainful stroke, that you're maybe hoping to draw more discard spells or mana for the Snapcaster into Thoughtseize. But overall, the impact of a Jace, and these decks are usually playing only 4 Planeswalkers, is so high compared to a single Path to Exile, more or less, that I would always prefer my opponent to have a Path instead of a Jace in their hand.
And as things stand here, Salvato, the way that his game has gone thus far has been pretty good. He's been able to deal with the key threats that have come down from Ben Jones. He's got an absolute powerhouse hand full of game-ending threats and indeed another answer for when he needs it. He's got the land to cast all these things. If you're Salvato a game up, you're going to be feeling all right about this, the way this one's going.
Yeah, if all my games could go pretty good like that, I would be
Playing
be
for
very
Player of the
happy.
Year.
Yeah.
So Snapcaster Mage and Thoughtseize means that now Ben gets to get a second look at what's going on the other side. There's still those two Planeswalkers. He now at least knows about the oust. Now, each of these Planeswalkers could quite reasonably get cast next turn.
Exactly. So it's really about which of them do you want to see the least.
Just a land off the top there for Luis Salvato, and immediately throws down Jace the Mind Sculptor and the 0 ability, so a Brainstorm ability there from Jace. Minimize the impact of information that the Thoughtseize could have given, and also play that oust. So now there's no cards left in Salvato's hand that Ben Jones can be sure he saw.
And Collargan's command can't take out Jace with the help of Snapcaster Mage.
Jones on the back foot here, plays a Planeswalker of his own. Now, the minus ability on Ben's Liliana does get him back a Death Shadow, which at least he can cast as a creature, but right now it's both not a very big creature and it's a creature for which there's already an answer in play for Salvato. More Brainstorm abilities. I must admit, I remember when Jace was in Standard, there was always so much temptation to go for the plus ability for me, to kind of try and lock up the game that way, but often the 0 ability does lock up the game just in a slightly different fashion, by meaning that you have an unassailably good hand, or in this case, if you wanted to, you could have a Terminus on the top of your deck, for example.
Brainstorming is just far too powerful. It has to be the absolute default when you untap with a Jace. And you need a very good reason to not brainstorm, to deviate from that default.
So Field of Ruin dealing with one of Ben Jones's land there, the Blood Crypt that was his only source of red mana. We'll now find out exactly how many basics he has. He fetches up an island, which suggests to me that he might not be playing at a mountain, because the first mountain, pretty important.
Yeah, you usually have only 1 or 2 basics in these deck lists.
And I guess if there's a basic to skip, it would be mountain just because of Blood Moon.
Exactly.
Street Wraith gets cycled here.
That's not bad. That pumps up the Death Shadow a little bit. I think Luis is ready though with Terminus.
Liliana needs must tick up here, surely. And just the Death Shadow. Nothing too exciting here. Opt coming along.
Ooh.
Rest in Peace, the pickup. I like Rest in Peace quite a bit in this matchup. It's one of those cards that this is not a deck that is traditionally considered to be the big graveyard deck. But it does mean that a lot of the cards in the deck are just not as effective.
Absolutely. Collargan's Command, all the Delph creatures, and Snapcaster Mage. That's already a huge amount.
Counter Squall there coming from Ben Jones.
Is this from some Commander reprint?
I think so, yes. Jace the Mind Sculptor finds his best buddy. There's Teferi.
Luis is demonstrating why bringing White-Blue Control to this event is such a good choice. He's one of the best players in the game right now. He has his buys to circumvent some of the more odd decks that float around in Modern. And then he can just capitalize on suboptimal plays by opponents, or the fact that with his deck choice, every game is drawn out and involves a ton of decision points for each player.
So Path to Exile there cleared the way so that Snapcaster Mage could attack Liliana, but we still wanted to have 2 Planeswalkers on the battlefield, so Luis generously decides that he'll just do all of the work in that regard and plays Teferi, Hero of Dominaria.
Yep, we got to keep the balance.
Now, the interaction between Teferi, Hero of Dominaria and Jace on its own is just phenomenal. If you ever get up to having a Teferi emblem in play, Jace's Brainstorm ability suddenly becomes a triple Vindicate on top of everything else that it's doing.
It's quite scary when you realize how potent, how fast, how dangerous the Grixis Death Shadow feels when you play against it. And Luis has just dismantled it from the get-go. And that was, as far as I can tell, without super high impact sideboard cards. The Rest in Peace that might come down now is only an afterthought, really.
Yeah, a value addition that you might as well use rather than that you necessarily need to. Ben has 1 mana untapped. There would be a temptation here if it were me to throw a Celestial Colonnade at Liliana here just to be sure, but either way round, Luis Salvato is in great shape here.
Yeah, but you don't want to spend your turn trading it with a Fatal Push, although that's very unlikely to still be in Ben Jones's deck. And as long as that Liliana is not really threatening anything, you can also just leave it be.
Looks like Luis, much like my good self, just likes the idea of kind of the ultimate victory. I am a notoriously greedy Magic player in that regard. Rest in Peace now coming along. This is a blue-white deck that it gets to get most of the value out of Rest in Peace that it would even be possible to, because it doesn't really lean on its graveyard all that hard. It is a symmetrical effect. So there's a small cost to losing your graveyard, your Snapcaster Mages, maybe Logic Knots aren't quite as good, but all told, this feels like it's well in Salvato's favor.
Yeah, and the matchups where you bring in Rest in Peace, it's always guaranteed that the negative impact for your opponents is much higher. And of course, all these cards are also going to exile. I think when you have a Rest in Peace in play, it's the best thing you can do is actually you just leave your exile pile where your graveyard used to be, and you put all of them you turn all of them 90 degrees or something like that.
This is a pretty dominant display here at this point by Luis Salvato. Yes, his Logic Knots he's going to have to tap lots of mana for, but he's got so many more lands in play than Ben Jones at this point that even where in other matchups those Logic Knots would be do-nothings, he can still be using them to positive effect here. And if I'm Ben Jones looking at a grip of 5 cards in the hand of the number 3 ranked player in the world right now, down a game, this seems not completely game over, but pretty close.
Luis doesn't have to do anything. He just sits there with his 2 Planeswalkers. He's generating 3 cards each turn where Ben Jones is drawing 1. You have all these counters, and soon there will be the Teferi emblem, which is the only thing you care about.
There'll be a big old smile on Luis's face, I'm sure. One of the real sort of friendly faces that you see on the Pro Tour, and a fierce competitor when it comes right down to it, having a fantastic season. He will, of course, be flying across to Las Vegas very, very soon after this event, because Team Hararuya Latin, they are going to be in the team series. He will, of course, also be in the World Championship. This is going to be a fantastic 10 days or so for Luis Salvato, even if it works out that somehow from here the wheels come off. But right now,
I think flying here is the real prize, because
yes,
you're going from the US back to Europe. You are hoping to spike a top 8 to even have a chance at Player of the Year, and then you fly back, you get jet lagged again, and is it really worth it? Because your Worlds preparation and your tiredness at Worlds itself is definitely at risk.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a real consideration, and I know that from speaking to Reed Duke last night, it was something that was on his mind as well, that there is that balance to be struck. And it's, I guess that the value in picking up that title is still pretty big. And these guys, I think that Luis had known that he was going to be coming to this for a while, and he's a fierce competitor. He wasn't ever going to say no to having the opportunity to get that trophy.
Yeah, it might not be entirely rational, but we all understand what's at the stake here.
Yeah, I mean, being the first South American player of the year would be a fantastic exclamation point to what has already been an incredible season for Salvato. Reed Duke, for those of you that are just catching up, he's also come across to Stockholm in Sweden here in order to chase that dream of getting the Player of the Year title, taking it away from his countryman Seth Manfield at the last possible opportunity. Right now, though, unlike Luis, Reed has picked up a couple of losses. He's playing Abzan this weekend, and he's essentially in a spot now where he's going to have to win out pretty much for the rest of the tournament if he wants to be able to keep that dream alive of becoming Player of the Year.
Yeah, Reed is a little bit obsessed with black-green decks in Modern, and two quick losses, definitely not how he wanted to start.
It's going to be a tough one for him. I guess that he may have to console himself with the fact that he is going to be at Worlds and he's going to be able to have a fantastic time there and potentially get some silverware for the old shelf there. So having a look at the people that are going to be at the World Championship, it's obviously just a murderer's row of talent. We've got a bunch of Pro Tour champions, more Pro Tour champions than normal thanks to Pro Tour 25th anniversary. So Seth won Pro Tour Ixalan, Luis won Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan, Wyatt Darby from Dominaria. Then we have 3 Pro Tour champions from Pro Tour 25th anniversary. Collectively, Alan Wu, Ben Hull and Greg Orange were able to get things going there, but they will be playing individually when it comes to the World Championship. And there's a couple more players that we got on the first page here. We had our constructed and limited masters, including Elias Watsfeld of Sweden. He will be flying across after this event, the Draft Master. Now we're going to have a look at the Geo region top point earners. North American champion Seth Manfield. Now, he, of course, already had an invite from winning the Pro Tour.
So he gets to compete twice.
Yes. No, that's not how it works at all. No, it works out that essentially there will be a few more open slots later on. We'll get to them in a moment. Marcio Carvalho, the European champion. Ken Yukihiro from the APAC region. He was the champion there. Luis Salvato. Well, this is another name that got invitations for multiple reasons. So, again, more at-large slots became available based on overall pro point finishes. So if we slide on across, here are the at-large top pro point earners making it in for various reasons, and this is where Reed Duke got in there, alongside his teammate Owen Turtenwald. And then let's have a look at the rest of this list. We've got Ben Stark, we've got John Rolfe, Martin User, Hall of Famer now, Gregor Kowalski, Javier Dominguez. He was the finalist at the World Championship last year from Spain and hoping to go one better, of course, this year. Andrea Mengucci, a 2-time winner of the World Championships in Shahar Shenhar, the exact same number of pro points as Brian Brown-Duin, who was a world champion himself back in Seattle. Jerry Thompson, Brad Nelson, who is, of course, in the class alongside Seth Manfield, hoping to potentially make Hall of Fame this year. Mike Sigrist, and then finally, he was the one that was really kind of worried about how things were going in detail in terms of the conclusion of the last Pro Tour. Matt Nass on 54 points was able to make it in there. Nice to see Matt Nass in there, because Matt Nass, I feel like in some respects a lot of his big talents in the game are ones that don't necessarily always get reflected on the scoreboard, at least not for him, which is to say that one of the things that I see Matt Nass as being just a real shining light about is innovation within the game, within the field of deck building, and making interesting decisions that impact the game as a whole by finding decks that other people might never have found.
Mm-hmm. And also, if you look at the GP results he's had this season, it's just phenomenal.
Yes,
it's good. We all know that the Pro Tour results are what makes up for the large amount of pro points, but still, it's good to see that rewarded. With Clarkron Ironworks, 2 GP wins and another top 8, incredible.
Just incredible finish. And yeah, with Matt Nass, the way that I feel about it is that there are some decks that would be found always. So, for example, I don't feel like the fact that a red-black aggro deck has done very well at a whole variety of standard tournaments is necessarily a huge credit to any one deck designer, and I think that the Hive Mind would have got there. There are other lists, though, that I don't believe would exist in the way that they exist were it not for specifically Matt Nass. And so in that regard, I'm really happy to see that he was able to make it in as the final person to make it in terms of pro points at large. But we're going to focus back on this tournament now. So let's have a look at the metagame of players specifically that had 3 buys in this event. It's not a large number of players, but in terms of players that we know are going to be potentially a big deal in the tournament, there's just a small number of them, but they're all good enough players that they've earned the right to start off with 3 wins.
Yeah, and this is 31 players. So you can see that white-blue control is 30% of the metagame of the 3-buy players. If you add Jeskai control, which is not a variant of white-blue control, but they are as similar as it gets, you are at almost half of the gold and platinum pros, Hall of Famers, and so on.
And there are some of these decks that we've seen on camera already. For example, at this point, the cat is very much out of the bag that the one lone 3-buy player with Abzan is Reduke. But there are a couple of interesting ones in here. We saw Blue-Red Ascension in round 4. It would have been in the hands of one of the Viren brothers. That one, a really interesting list that I'm intrigued to see how it performs over the course of the weekend. Mono-White Martyr of Sands, a really interesting choice that I'm intrigued to see more about potentially in our feature match area at some point before we get to the end of this weekend. Hardened Scales I like quite a bit, but once we get past the big ones, the fact that there's lots of singleton decks here, I think it's a nice message about kind of how things end up playing out in Modern when it comes to deck choice.
Not surprised by Control being big. Not surprised about Bund Spirits edging out Humans as the Ether Vial deck, but still, I think with 7 decks total, also very well represented. And then some interesting deck choices. Burn is not a deck that we usually see highly represented in the 3-buy metagame. Devoted Company, I like the deck, but it's not the tier 1 deck that I would assume people tend towards.
Well, you know what? This is the last GP of the season. If you're a player that's kind of just playing for this one weekend, looking to get the best result you can this weekend, but not with your kind of overall year on the line in terms of the results, maybe it's time to just have a little bit of fun with it. As things stand, though, we have hit the end of our round 6. Just a few more rounds left today. Do not go anywhere. It will be Riley and Raf with you for round 7. Bubble matches ahoy after these messages.